Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches. I'm your host for today, Xiomara Corpeño. And we just want to remind folks we're on every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And today we're going to talk about the border that nobody's talking about, which is all of Mexico. And we actually have a really amazing guest with us today, Arturo Viscarra, who is with Chirla, Mexico, and he's actually joining us from Tapachula, which is the southern border between Mexico and Guatemala, and to tell us what's happening down there, but really to also to talk to us about what's happening with Central Americans. Like we're not really talking about the racism and the history of what's happening and has led us up to this moment. So welcome to the show, Arturo. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you? I'm
great. Great to have you on. So the first question is, let's just start kind of big picture. You know, Biden ran, the new administration ran as an opposition to really the dictatorship and authoritarian of Donald Trump, right? And especially around immigration. He said he was going to move the moon and the stars for us. And here we are 4 months in, right? We've just passed 100 days and we are seeing very little happening around the border, right? The border remains basically effectively closed, and Trump's policies of kicking people, of not letting people in to ask for their right for asylum, right, is basically still in rigor. Well, tell us what your thoughts are on that and what you're seeing on the ground as a result of this administration change.
Well, I mean, as far as what has changed, it's it's little as far as the policies are concerned, but because of just people's desperations and their, not necessarily their perceptions of Biden, but what their hopes are for Biden, like they want it to be better. Plus the manipulation that occurs by the traffickers and coyotes. Those things have made kind of a change, plus the policy of allowing the unaccompanied minors in, which was something that Trump was going to have to do as well because of some court decisions and negotiations with, as far as lawsuits are concerned. But without getting in too deep into that, I would just say that all of this is, you know, it's very difficult to understand the situation on the ground, both here at the southern border and the northern border of Mexico with the U.S., as well as Central America, without looking at the history of the relationship between the U.S. and Central America. Mexico to a lesser degree, but also Mexico as well. The relationship between the U.S. and Central America for hundreds of years, literally, you know, since I believe, you know, the late 1800s, you know, some historians have, you know, called it that all of Central America and the Caribbean were U.S. client states at that point. So we're talking about, you know, 140, 150 years ago. That's never really changed, you know? So I think it's just, first and foremost is all of this conversation about the root causes, which is something that was just only in the NGO world for like years and years, and now the government, you know, is really, you know, using the root causes of migration. Look, the root causes of migration is U.S. policy, like, and we can go into the specifics of it, but it's also just as much. It's just simple. You don't have to become an expert on the specific policies. It's just basically of knowing that the U.S. is such a huge influence. The policies that they implement are approved by the U.S. or they're shoved down the throats of Central America. That's just the way it's always been. So if the policies haven't worked, that means that the U.S. is responsible for imposing destructive policies.
Right. Well, right now, Biden has, you know, you just while I speak, we're having some technical difficulties, but So, Biden has designated Vice President Kamala Harris to figure out what's happening at the border, but also to talk with the home countries, the sending countries, about how we can make sure that people are able to stay home. And I think, the rhetoric on the media is like, oh, these people are racing to come over. And I think people don't realize, actually Salvadorans and Guatemalans would love to stay in their home country, but they're being pushed out, right? And so how has the U.S. actually been paying, right, shelling out money that's pushing out, and giving it to these governments, right, that are then pushing our communities out? What is the money that the U.S. is giving in aid, right? They call it, aid for Central America or aid packages. Well, what's included in that's adding to this immigration?
I mean, for a very long time, they say this aid, blah, blah, blah. There's a huge, this is not my expertise, right? And I wish I had some more detailed statistics on some of this, but, a lot of what is aid, it just really ends up recycled in Washington or in the U.S. The U.S. government says they're going to give this X amount of millions, and then a lot of that money just goes to a U.S. contractor that either for providing, construction or some sort of, and yeah, they might subcontract out locally some of that. But then there's also services, and then there's, you have all these other programs, gang prevention and violence prevention and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of it doesn't even get into the hands of the local economy, right? That's the point, right? One. Secondly, a lot of this other stuff, the aid, even if some of it can go to the government, and then there's a lot of corruption involved. But even if it doesn't go to the government, if it goes to nonprofit organizations in Central America, and then obviously this could be applied to, throughout the world, throughout the developing world, throughout the third world. I like to own the term third world, whatever. It just goes to politically connected organizations that are, dominated by oligarchs and their rich allies, right? So it doesn't really get to the people. There's several videos on YouTube. You can find them. That's why I can't even point to one, where people in different news, obviously since the caravans have been a huge thing in the last, at this point, 3 years, where people ask, well, they're threatening to cut off the aid, and you guys are, because of the caravan, and people are like, what? How does that concern me? We don't see any of that aid.
They've never seen that aid in the first place.
Yeah. Right. What's the difference? Okay. So, that would be it. That's all I have to say about aid. It goes to military. A lot of this militarization, and it's really about opening the markets. It's all about geopolitical interests and which are military, and then economic interests
or other.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exploitative labor. That's it. So do you want migration or do you want the places to be livable? Choose one. So it's a shame that it has to be at the cost of so much suffering and loss of lives of people. But the fact that the migrants are forcing this conversation on in the United States is a silver lining, and in a way it's also darkly humorous, because it's so it's just so heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, and I just want to remind folks that you can drop your comments or questions in the chat if you're watching right now on YouTube or Facebook Live, and we will try to answer them if we get them. And tell us a little bit about, well, what is it that Central Americans, right? And we know that there are many other migrants who are going through Central America and Mexico to get to that southern border with the U.S. But let's focus on Central Americans, because actually it's there's just sort of scapegoating. Oh, it's the Central American migration. But actually, can you tell us what is it that Central Americans are facing as they're coming up through Mexico to come to the U.S.? what are the policies, but actually the real life things that are happening to families, to women, to children as they're coming up.
Well, I mean, for a very long time, it's been a kind of dangerous, trail, the Migrant Trail through Mexico. So for Central Americans and for other folks to come, in the past there used to be more Ecuadorians. There's still all these nationalities that I'm gonna mention, but in the past there used to be more Ecuadorians, more Peruvians, relatively. But now, as far as Latin America and the Caribbean are concerned, it's vast majority of Central American, some Cubans, a decent amount of Haitians, a good amount of Haitians, and some Venezuelans. They're mostly going to other parts of South America. So, but what has happened is and this is purposeful. I mean, if you look back at U.S. government documents and whatnot, this is a purposeful thing. And it gets mixed in with the drug war, right? The war on drugs makes things more violent and dangerous for everybody living in Mexico or traveling through it, or also in these countries of origin in Central America, and for other folks that are coming through those countries. But so then, since it was escalated in 2006, and that was under president's, it was right after Felipe Calderón came into power for Mexico, and at that time, obviously, it was still Bush. And they planned to escalate the war, but from the very beginning, you see how there's an economic motivation of for the U.S. when you see their government, just like the primary government documents, it's always democracy and free markets, or democracy and capitalism are interchangeable, as if they're the same exact thing, which is just regardless of your ideology, that's intellectually dishonest. And if you're going to make policies that way, come on, how is it not going to be a disaster?
And because you mentioned the drug trade, I think that people should know it's the U.S. is giving money to Mexican military and the Mexican government to stop migrants from coming up. But the cartels are also making money off of migrants as well, right? And then the cartels in Mexico and the Mexican government in many ways are in cahoots, right, at different levels. And so there is money to be made on all levels, right? USAID, but then at the same time, the cartels are then using this. And we've seen too many cases of migrants who've been murdered or disappeared on the trail. And so I feel like it's any which way. You stay in the home country, you get exploited at a maquila, right? Or they steal your land. You're coming up through Mexico, you get kidnapped, extorted, or you're paying a coyote. Or Mexican police officer who just took away all your earthly belongings on your trail north. The money is flowing, that's for sure, and so are the migrants. And it's but I was gonna say since 2006, nobody knows exactly for sure. There's very few organizations that even attempt to give an estimation, but we've been, I've been fairly comfortable for many years saying that there's roughly 10,000 migrants a year that are killed or disappeared in Mexico. So we're talking since the escalation of the drug war in 2006. So it's just 2006 December, so 2007. So we're talking about, at this point, 14 years of this heightened militarization. So that's 140,000 people mostly from Central America that have been killed or disappeared. We don't really know because then there's all these, but Mexico, they find, clandestine mass graves, it's not even news because they just find them all the time, because then there's also people, because there's another number that is bigger of Mexicans, but it's all mixed in, and then the Central Americans forgotten because of Mexican nationalism, because nobody cares and blah blah blah. Let's get into that Mexican nationalism. So I grew up in LA, which people feel hey, growing up in the Latino city, things might have been different for you. But, actually living in a majority Mexican city back fucking 40 years ago, like we were not treated nicely by Mexicans or Chicanos, for the most part, not everybody. I think now it's a little bit different, having like co-lived together, et cetera. But that discrimination is really big. And I think part of it's because Mexico has really done an immense job of really instilling patriotism and the national project of what is Mexico, right? Even though in the South, you still have a lot of states and communities who rebel against the Mexican government because it has been imposed on them, but by far and large. And so what is the type of discrimination you see against Central Americans who are coming up through Mexico? And then how are they able to know that you're Central American? What are kind of the giveaways that they exploit?
Well, especially here in Chiapas and the southern border, especially with Guatemala, there's communities that are transnational, and they have been, because there's just a lot of trade, on the river, people are we're poor, we're not paying the taxes, we're just trying to figure out how to make money off all this stuff, which, and that's always been tolerated, right? And then there's also indigenous communities that have been separated by the Mexican-Guatemalan border, right? That were here before that. I'm just going to acknowledge that. I could not speak on it more than that. I actually bought a book my first day in Mexico about this topic, about the indigenous communities that are separated by the Mexican-Guatemalan border, and I lost it. I bought it, I lost it the same day, and then I searched for it online. I went to a couple academic bookstores, couldn't find it. Anyway, so I don't know anything about it besides that these communities exist, right? Because that's just not, it's complicated. But and there's been other Central American migration here for a long time. Again, mostly Guatemalan, but during the wars, during the 80s, there's also a huge amount of Guatemalans that were here, and then they went back after the war. But then there's people that stayed and blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, people, and there's historical migration, but people don't rep their Central Americans. They just blend in. They marry and they blend in. It's not, that's really what happens for the most part. So you don't have these kind of Central American communities. But I think that's something that's changing now, not because Mexico is a more welcoming place, because it's always been an issue of discrimination. Before, maybe in the past, it wasn't as violent as it is now. But it was, job discrimination, you got a funny accent, blah, blah, blah. And, it's interesting. So people are, Go ahead. Finish. I was going to say, out of necessity, there's going to be more and more Central Americans and other migrants that are staying here in Mexico because the U.S. is not allowing in as many migrants as in the past. Yeah. And that's its own dilemma for the U.S. as far as the economy is concerned, as far as Social Security, at least as far as even on that. Obviously, we don't want to, put migrants into just what is their economic impact? Obviously, that we both know that's way beyond that, right? But at the same time, it is a question for the U.S. to consider if that's really what they want long term, right? Secondly, it's just more people are going to stay here that are from, and they're not going to be able to go. And then, it's just Mexico is really, it's super nationalistic. People know so little about Central America. In a way, for example, how people just get upset about you don't know nothing, to somebody from the U.S., you don't know nothing about Mexico, it's your neighbor, right? And it's just
Mexicans don't know anything about Guatemalans.
Yeah, you guys don't know nothing about Guatemala. You need to apply some of this right. Logic, because it's correct logic. I do want to say though, it's not just that piece though. It's just also seeing folks as less than human. I went to a shelter a couple of years ago. This was right after the 2018 caravan, and the person who runs the shelter was these
Central American women are different than Mexican women. Mexican women they're humble and have modesty. You know, they don't get undressed. These Central American women, they will just undress in front of everybody. And then that causes problems between family. Crazy things that they say, you know, without even really thinking about it. And it's a little astounding to me, having done immigrant rights organizing in the States and mostly working with Mexicans, about just how pervasive like the racism, right, and prejudice there is around Central Americans in Mexico.
They're shocked. I mean, they don't. It's so, you know, Mexican nationalism was like falsely created, right? Like it was purposefully created because it's such a huge country. You know, there's still like, you know, 70 something indigenous languages spoken, and, you know, all sorts of, you know, it's, you know, there was like a purposeful project to instill nationalism and create kind of like these iconic symbols of Mexico. And I'm not trying, this is not like, I'm not trying to like, you know, crap on Mexico or its folks. I think my umbrage more than anything is more about how the powers that be, whether it be the Mexican oligarchy or the U.S. oligarchy, U.S. imperialism, the Salvadoran oligarchies, well, how they utilize nationalism to pit people that have more in common than differences against one another, right? And that's the issue, that's the problem, you know, and you know, people aren't, they're viewed, yeah, there's like this whole thing about about Central American women being, you know, whores and prostitutes, and I don't know where that exactly started, but it's a common thing. And now, and then Central American men are gang members, you know, and they're threats. And even within the Mexican immigrant rights organizations and communities, it's at a place where you're just like, the things that are acceptable here, as far as even the human immigrant defenders in the U.S. would no longer fly. They used to fly in the U.S., but now there isn't. And what I mean by that is like, it's all more from this humanitarian perspective, as Frere would say. It's not a humanitist perspective, right? Mm-hmm. It's not about, you know, putting yourself in the position of the oppressed, but of, in a sense, fulfilling your own need for, you know, feeling good about yourself and feeling important.
Yeah, that's really that charity model.
Exactly.
Like,
charity,
I'm going to help these poor people. They don't have food. They don't have.
It's a lot of that. And I will give them a break on this, in this part. Because nobody wants to stay in Mexico, so they were just going through. So it was like, let's give them some food on their way, blah, blah, blah. So, and there's also not this like, and again, people were just blending in because it's like this constant drip of Central American migration that's not very perceivable. So they're just blending in. But now now things are really changing, and they have to. Even if it's not going to change all over Mexico, it's not enough people, but at least in certain places, there's going to be a change. But these Mexican organizations and activists, they're still kind of, they're not caught up, and because they're not recognizing their own nationalism, so they treat people, and I'm stealing this directly from a feminist anthropologist, Professor Amarela Varela. She's amazing, and she says people here, you know, even if they treat people they treat them as three things: as clients, as victims, or as threats. Or sometimes it could be two, or sometimes all three, even, you know? So, and it's just kind of like, let's just see these people as people, you know? They're good, they're bad, they're sometimes good, you know what I mean? Like, they're just people doing the thing that humans have always done, which is move out of a place that cannot sustain their lives and the lives of their family. It's not even so much of like, let me go, you know, find the best place in the world. It's some of it is just like, this isn't working. Let's, you know.
Yeah, let's go to the next place.
Yeah, next place, right?
We have
That's
a couple of minutes.
evolution, right?
We have a couple of minutes left, so I really am so grateful that you're able to paint this picture, because I think that a lot of times when people think about the border, they're only thinking about that southern U.S. border between Mexico and the U.S. And I feel like what I'm getting from you, and not just from this conversation, is that southern border in Mexico, that it's very similar, right, with the Mexican military paid for by U.S. dollars, keeping migrants out. And then actually actively chasing them and detaining, and the conditions are worse. Mm-hmm. So in the last couple of minutes, I would love for you to tell me and our audience, like, how is it that we can, what can we do from here, right? Especially now that, there's an opportunity for some kind of legalization for like 3 million people that the president has put out. Obviously, that wouldn't even cover all the undocumented people in the United States, but we're going to get what we can to change the material conditions of our communities. But what can people do to make sure that we keep our eye on this, and that we don't find this acceptable, and we don't allow Mexico to continue to be the filter and the border now for the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had more time, because obviously it's at the end of the day, all of this is so hugely influenced by the U.S. Everything, like in a sense, there's this opportunity in Mexico with AMLO, with the new president, to make a decision about migrants. Like, is he going to take a more welcoming approach, or is he going to be influenced by the rising global fascism, which obviously Trump being like number one symbol, and unfortunately they took the other choice. They took that choice, right? So this discrimination against folks is there's all that money and politics, and I wish we could talk more about that, because we're seeing how, like on the daily, how there's more expulsions, kind of like what they're doing in the northern country, of saying, oh, because of COVID we can't allow asylum seekers in, but commercial traffic can keep on going. Obviously it's not for medical reasons. It's just right. You're trying to, right? And so you're seeing the repetition of all these things, of also focusing on unaccompanied minors, because that's a political headache for Biden and the Democrats. And Mexico, but they don't want to admit that, because that's one of the contradictions of Mexican nationalism, is that they want to pretend like they're not they're not doing things because the U.S. told them, which is one of the reasons why the whole thing is messed up, but we're not talking, that's not the focus of the show. So it's messed up. I mean, we're joking, but it's a lot of suffering. I think one of the things that we need to do is really just break from this. Also all of this that's happening provides us an opportunity to break from the mental constraints of only worrying about things that happen within our borders as U.S. citizens, including only worrying about migrants once they enter into the U.S. Now U.S. policy is extended and become foreign policy to keep them out of Mexico, even to keep them out of Guatemala. So the border keeps on going down, down, down. That's our own tax money, and that's something. It's lazy to only, in my opinion, it's lazy to not worry about, to care about migrants in the U.S., but not care about them before they reach the U.S. It's lazy, and in my opinion, intellectually dishonest, because the U.S. is also responsible for creating the reasons for them to leave and keeping them out of the U.S.
I think a lot of organizations who say that they do immigration policy in the U.S. when asked, hey, actually let's push the administration around actually this money that's going to Mexico to enforce actually U.S. immigration law. They're like, oh, that's foreign policy. And
Honduras,
yeah.
El Salvador.
And El Salvador. And so that's
Panama,
foreign policy. That's foreign policy. As if it's detached from, and it's actually, no, it's our money. And it's actually keeping people from coming to the border. So Arturo, I'm so sorry. This is all the time that we have. We'd love to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for shining a light a little bit about what's happening and what I'm calling the new border, which is all of Mexico, in terms of filtering our communities and other migrant communities who are coming up.
It's catchy. I like it.
Okay, all right, we can do some work around that. All right, thank you, Arturo, for being with us
Thank
today.
you.
For our audience, did you want to say one last thing, Arturo?
Just thank you for being awesome. That's all.
Thank you. I want to thank our viewers for joining us today. Please join us next Wednesday, same time, same live channel on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll see you all later.